signing in from. My name is Nana Ndukwe Hedge. I'm the global lead for the UN System Mental Health and Wellbeing Strategy. I'll be joined today with my global team members who will also be assisting in the smooth running of the event. So just so that you know, in the background, we have Chung Tran, who will be managing the timekeeping. And in terms of monitoring the chat and the Q&A, my colleague Lucia Vinti and also Wilna Gracias will be monitoring that. And last but not least, in terms of the tech support, Marie Van Rost will also be assisting with that. To get us started, I really want to just give thanks to IAEA, who provided us with a short video to begin this event. Over. So thanks again to everyone for joining us today. And before we get started, I'd like to just let you know that the session will be recorded and added to our website, the Healthy Workforce website. So please do feel free to put your cameras on or to turn them off as you see fit. You can also turn on the live captioning by clicking on the top bar and clicking on the More if you look at the three dots, and then select your preferred language and speech, and which will show the live captions. We'll also, of course, have time for Q&A, and we invite you to add them into the Q&A function. Our team will be monitoring the Q&A, and we'll also share the questions with myself, the moderator, and also the panelist. So why this session then on nurturing neurodiversity in the workplace? So as many of you know, across the UN system, there's a growing recognition of the value that neurodivergent talent brings to the workplace. Staff with lived experience of neurodiversity contribute unique perspectives, problem-solving skills, and innovation. But they also face significant barriers such as stigma, feeling psychologically unsafe, and the pressure to mask their identities in professional settings. So addressing these barriers aligns directly with the UN system workplace mental health and wellbeing strategy, which of course, as you know, emphasizes fostering inclusive, respectful, and a supportive environment that only safeguard the mental health and wellbeing of all personnel. So today we're really pleased to bring together a panel of experts and colleagues with lived experience to not only reduce stigma, but also to continue to build a culture of belonging where neurodiversity and our colleagues who with lived experience are supported and empowered to thrive. Before we begin the conversation and we go into more depth, we'd like to begin by showing you a 2-minute video from Differing Minds. Differing Minds is an organisation in the UK that is dedicated to providing workplace training on neurodiversity and inclusion. And I think it will really give you some context, particularly in differentiating the terminology between neurodivergence and neurodiversity. So over to the team to show the video. So today we're really pleased to be joined by three panelists, and we look forward to learning from them as they each speak to the topic of today. So we have Mina Mojtahedi from the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy at the Executive Office of the Secretary General. We also have Ms. Zoe Gan, Disability Inclusion Manager, Culture and Diversity Team, Division of People and Culture at UNICEF, and also Beatriz Bastayo, representative of the ILO ERG on disability and inclusion. And so for each of those speakers, I'll go more a bit into their background as we turn the interventions to them. And Ms. Mina Mojtahedi is the Disability Inclusion Team Lead at the Executive Office of the Secretary General. The Disability and Inclusion Team monitors, coordinates, and supports the system-wide implementation of the UN Disability and Inclusion Strategy. Mina, good to see you here, and thank you for joining the panel. To start off this conversation, I'll pose the first question to you. And I wondered whether you could tell us a bit about the UN Disability and Inclusion Strategy, and really how is the UN ensuring inclusion of staff with neurodivergence and addressing the most common barriers that they first face in the UN workplaces? Over.
Thank you, Nana. Thank you to the Mental Health Office, the whole team, for organizing this and doing a lot of campaigning around mental health awareness this month. I'm very happy to be here and share some insights into the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy and how that connects with mental health, but in this case specifically with any staff who are neurodivergent. So what is the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy? Just a very brief overview, as perhaps many on following this event are not familiar. It is an initiative that was launched by the Secretary General in 2019, and now has been implemented for 6 years. It applies to the entire UN system. So what we mean by that is that all UN entities are expected to implement the strategy, and it applies also to the resident coordinator system, so also implemented by UN country teams. And it really sets out the Secretary General's vision for lasting and transformative change on disability inclusion. And it was in recognition that where the UN as a system is doing work towards rights and inclusion of persons with disabilities, a lot more needs to be done, and it needs to be done in a sort of coherent and cohesive way. So how it connects with what we're talking about today is that the strategy aligns with the Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And that means that the way we understand disability is how it's understood in the convention. And that means that it's not just about an individual person's impairment, but it's actually about the intersection of that impairment with barriers that individual person might be facing in sort of equal participation within their community. And that applies also to the workplace. So for example, I'm a wheelchair user. The fact that I can be here working in the executive office means that the building is physically accessible to wheelchair users. And so that's the great news, is that we can actually do something about the barriers. We can identify them and we can remove them, and we can create an inclusive world and an inclusive work environment in the UN. So the way that impairments are understood in the convention, it covers not just the physical impairments, as the example I gave, also sensory impairments such as vision, related to vision or hearing. It includes mental health, also intellectual and learning disabilities, and neurodivergent would be falling under one of these impairments. And why this is a good framework to also support colleagues who are neurodivergent is that through the convention, through the strategy, any barriers that staff who are neurodivergent might be facing within their workplace we are committed and we have the obligation to identify and remove those barriers so that they can fully participate in the workplace and fulfill their responsibilities just like everybody else and feel included, most importantly. And this is where the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy intersects with the mental health strategy, and that where the mental health strategy really applies to the workforce, and the scope of the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy is much broader. It applies to programs and operations, and also the employment. There are intersections in terms of an inclusive organizational culture. That means, I've mentioned, identifying the barriers and removing those. Those barriers can also be sort of biases, whether unconscious or conscious, can also be stigma related to whatever, the impairment or the disability is. It's about having inclusive human resource policies. It's about building the capacity of all staff across the UN, and including managers, to understand disability and be able to foster an inclusive work environment for all staff. I think I'll leave it there and hand it back to you, Nana. I'm happy to answer any further questions.
Thanks so much, Mina. And I know that later on you might have to leave a bit early, but I'm pretty sure there'll be lots of questions directed to you. But very much appreciative of you outlining the strategic aspects, but also the convention that's really behind the idea of making sure that we do better when it comes to inclusion within this area. So thank you very much for your interventions. So I'm now going to move on to our next speaker, Zoe Gann, she, her. She leads the disability inclusion at the workplace at UNICEF and is the co-founder of Disability Connect, the organization's first employee resource group for staff with disabilities. With over a decade of experience in programming for children with disabilities, Zoe brings both professional expertise and lived experience to her work. She identifies as a person with disabilities, including neurodivergence and invisible disabilities. She is deeply committed to building inclusive, equitable environments where everyone can thrive. So Zoe, you're also welcome to the panel. For my next question, I wonder whether you could speak to what led to the development of the new resources on nurturing neurodivergent talent in an inclusive workplace for managers. And then relating to that, how can supervisees and managers best access and apply these resources in real time in the workplace? Over to you, Zoe, and thank you.
And thanks, Nia, for the question. So what you'll see on the screen is if you click one more time, I think you'll see the front cover, is a suite of resources called Nurturing Neurodivergent Talent in an Inclusive Workplace. And these are initially designed for internally for UNICEF. Sorry, if you click one more time, I think the front cover will pop up, but maybe not. But the development of these suites of resources was really driven by a real and urgent need expressed across UNICEF right from leaders, supervisors, HR, and people and culture professionals, all staff at all levels, really. Many felt underprepared, ill-equipped, and some carried a deep sense of deep fear of getting it wrong when it came to working with, supporting, supervising employees who are neurodivergent, and also, in how does that link to disability inclusion? There's sometimes a bit of misunderstanding and confusion about these two terms and whether or not they're connected, which they are. And at the same time, staff who were neurodivergent and staff wellbeing counsellors at UNICEF were also calling for guidance to prevent harm, to reduce burnout, to mitigate disabling working conditions, working environments that were especially causing increased levels of masking in the workplace. And this is some of the things that we were seeing in UNICEF. And I can speak to this personally. My own disabilities may not always be visible. Some might call them invisible or neurodivergent. but they are very visible in my life. You know, they shape how I process information, communicate, experience the world around me. But they are, when you can't see a disability, there is quite often a lot of confusion. To be honest with you, there's a lot of misunderstanding about disabilities, physical, visible, and invisible. But invisible, we're kind of focusing on here today. And so from just to give you a perspective from a lived experience for much of my life, and a lot of my time in the workplace, only up until fairly recently in the last few years, I've masked my neurodivergent traits out of fear of stigma and exclusion. And those fears are real, that, you know, they're perceived, but also they, you know, we have to acknowledge that they're real in the workplace, they exist in our workplaces. And the messages I was receiving up until very recently is that I'm too different, you know, I need to change, I need to be fixed. And internalizing that made me feel I need to cut out parts of me that make others feel uncomfortable. And that's something that many of us do, not necessarily just people who are neurodivergent, you know, when we're working, when we represent minority groups in certain situations, you know, there is quite often that feeling of needing to fit in and you know, taking parts of ourselves away in order to do that, to kind of fit the social norms. And it's really exhausting. It's really unhealthy, and from an organizational culture perspective, this isn't what UNICEF was striving to foster in terms of our core values and our approach to inclusion and belonging and representation. And this, alongside with like global discourse around disability and neurodivergence as it evolves, we're seeing a growing recognition of the need to challenge unconscious bias and outdated stereotypes of what is neurodivergence, what are invisible disabilities, understand the barriers faced by people with visible and invisible disabilities. They are different and diverse, but we quite often are faced with challenges, with barriers that need to be removed. And sometimes we can't remove them ourselves, they're systemic. The need to embrace neurodiversity is it's like a neurodivergence, sorry, as a naturally occurring and valid part of human variation and, you know, the way people think, and that recognizing neurodivergence is as a legitimate dimension of disability. These are all sorts of things that are emerging in the current discourse, evolving. And when we begin to you know, when we begin to kind of analyze this, we start to see that in certain spaces, employees feel they are more able to disclose their neurodivergent diagnosis. And in that space, they're not asking to be fixed. They're asking to be, or demanding to be understood and included and supported. And it's the zeitgeist is shifting from, you know, how can we, or, you know, these are the values that neurodivergent people have, into how can we enable them. So it's moving from why should we to how can we, or and making it more actionable. And really, we're asking for workplaces that are free from stigma, that are free from the need to mask or the pressure to mask, and that the systemic exclusion is broken down or dismantled. And we need to work together for that. So that's the basis, the foundation for the nurturing neurodivergent talent and inclusive workplace resources that we developed in UNICEF. They're tools designed to help managers, staff, teams build the inclusive workplace, adopt inclusive practices, cultivate curiosity, adopt solution-oriented mindsets. They're kind of practical toolkits on how to do this. You know, it's easy to say, let's become more inclusive, but how do you do this in practice when you're balancing heavy work schedules and there isn't an unaccommodating environment, there's misunderstanding and nervousness about talking about these things. So this is a way to break that ice and give people practical ways to move forward. And the great thing about this is that the strategies that benefit neurodivergent individuals, they make the workplace better for everyone. And this is really commonly seen across, when we talk about reasonable accommodation across the board, reasonable accommodations quite often when they're put into place thoughtfully and intentionally benefit everybody. They're very, very helpful for the employee that needs them, but on the whole, they benefit the workplace in a number of different ways. So coming back to the original question, how can managers, supervisors, and so on access the resources? Well, right now they are only on UNICEF's internal intranet, but we're working on developing a web page that will come out in the next week or so that will host all of what we have so far, and then we'll continue to post things as they become available. And what you will see is that there is a manager's guide. We have a short elective Managing People with Purpose e-module. It's kind of designed for management. We have a self-paced Agora course, which is a bit longer and has a lot of interactive scenarios and situational kind of exercises. We'll have checklists so that you can keep working on whether or not you're kind of adopting things in whatever process you are in the employee cycle. We're hoping to have a number of deeper global webinars coming out and those kinds of things in the future. But the resources are designed to be actionable. There's something that you can use in the moment when you need it. You can dip into different sections of it. You can work with colleagues one-on-one to say, look, we're having this discussion. Let's use this guide to work our way through it, to navigate team dynamics, to navigate potential disclosures or conflicts. It's not just about awareness. It's really very much about designing and equipping people with tools that enable them to act with empathy, with confidence, with clarity, and ultimately to foster that inclusive environment that we're all really striving for. Back to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Zoe. I'd really appreciated how you interwove the personal, but also your professional experiences in speaking to this important topic. But it really seems like UNICEF is making great strides to ensure that your organization is truly inclusive. And I appreciate also the focus on helping us to really understand the potential barriers and the challenges that still exist. And similar to Mina's intervention, I'm sure there'll be a huge amount of interest in knowing more about these resources within the roundtable part of this discussion. But thank you very much for your intervention. I'm now going to move on to our last but not least, our final speaker, Beatriz Bastayo. Beatriz is a young professional with a disability working on gender equality and disability inclusion in the International Labour Organization. She's been a member of the ILO ERG on disability and inclusion since joining ILO in March 2024. Beatriz, you're also welcome to the panel, and I would love to hear more about how you have navigated advocating for staff with disabilities through your work with ILO ERG on disability and inclusion. And also, what advice do you have for colleagues who have yet to access support for their accessibility needs? Over to you, and thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Nene, and thank you to the entire mental health strategy team for the invitation to be here today. And good morning, afternoon, or evening to all of you joining. As Nene said, I'm here today as a representative of the ILO Employee Resource Group on Disability Inclusion. So just as a start, I'd like to make it clear that I'm speaking on behalf of the group, and that means I do not represent the official views of the ILO, and of course I'm also not speaking on behalf of all staff with disabilities or neurodivergent persons, either within the UN system or beyond. Of course, I'm one voice among many, and I'm sharing collective experiences and insights from the members of our group. So with this said, just a little bit about the ERG. Our ERG was established in 2022, which was a pivotal moment for our organization. It's grounded on the principles of the ILO Disability Inclusion Strategy, which is under the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy that Mina presented, and strives for a workplace that is not only accessible, but also equitable and inclusive. So our members include staff with disabilities, staff with dependents with disabilities, and allies that are all united by the same goal, which is to make disability inclusion a lived reality within the ILO. So the ERG serves in a consultative capacity to both management and staff union as well. We offer technical expertise that is rooted in lived experience. I'm very happy to share that at the ILO, we've seen encouraging collaboration and leadership support to our ERG. For example, our former Deputy Director General was the ERG's executive sponsor, and she very actively engaged with ERG, always kept her doors open to hear our concerns, our ideas. Our HR colleagues have also shown very strong commitment to improving accessibility in recruitment and making disability inclusion training mandatory for all staff. These important steps were taken in consultation with the ERG, so in consultation with staff with disabilities. So we really believe that these partnerships have been very essential in turning advocacy into tangible change. But of course, as many of you know, advocacy, particularly around neurodiversity, is rarely straightforward. The most challenging part often lies in trying to dismantle or deconstruct unconscious bias and helping others understand that inclusion sometimes means doing things differently. So in a large, highly structured system like the UN, change can be very slow. But we do believe at the ERG that we're witnessing a cultural shift in the ILO. So we do see a growing openness and willingness to learn, which makes all the difference. Now to the second part of your question about the advice I would give to colleagues who haven't yet accessed support for their accessibility needs. So from our experience, one of the main reasons colleagues' needs go unmet is simply because they don't feel safe in disclosing these needs. And I want to make it very clear that I'm not trying to blame these colleagues. On the contrary, these hesitations come from very valid fears. So will I be judged? Will I be seen as less capable or less professional? Of course, these are real, deeply human concerns. But here's what we've learned. So suppressing our needs doesn't really make you a better colleague. It doesn't gain you anything, it just makes your day harder. And this can become a problem over the years. And all colleagues deserve to work in an environment that enables them to perform at their best, comfortably and confidently. So asking for what you need is not a weakness, is on the contrary an act of self-advocacy and self-respect. So if a colleague isn't sure where to start, reach out to your ERG, to your staff well-being officer, or to your staff union or association, because these structures exist to support you. And if you're in a position to listen to those requests, whether as a manager, HR office, or just peer, take that opportunity to build disability confidence and to contribute to a culture where everyone can thrive authentically. Thank you. Back to you, Nana.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, for outlining all these important points. And it sounds like the ERG was very much central to advocating change within your organization. I'm sure, like me, many others in the audience will also value the advice about reaching out and getting those resources so that you can we can instigate ongoing change. I'm pretty sure there'll be further questions, but we're now at the stage of moving into the overall discussion, which I'll rely on my colleagues to also check on the chat to see if there are any questions in there. But to maybe get us started, one thing I've always been pondering on as the global lead for the mental health strategy, and this is a question for the panel at large, is a lot of questions around what's the mental health strategy? How can we make sure that we are supporting the needs of, embracing neurodiversity within the workplace. So I guess to kick us off, how does neurodiversity intersect with mental health and well-being, especially in the workplace? If I can pose that question in the order in which we started. I see, Zoe, you have your hand up, so over to you.
Apologies. I don't mind if you want to go in the order. Sorry.
Okay, no, please go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
That's fine.
Yeah, well, I wanted to kind of touch on the from my perspective where I think the intersect is is one of the areas where I think the intersection is quite a concerning, is when is the concept of masking. You know, the need or the pressure to mask in the work environment that is not inclusive and disabling in a way. I feel that that's where the intersect between mental health and neurodiversity or neurodivergence comes together. And I've used the word, many of us have talked about masking in one shape or form. So I wanted to kind of give a couple of examples of what that actually is in reality. Masking refers to strategies that neurodivergent people often use to suppress or conceal traits and symptoms, or hide parts of us that we feel other people are uncomfortable about, in order to align ourselves more with neurotypical social norms. And these masking behaviors that can be conscious or unconscious, they can be developed over time. They can even be taught through therapeutic interventions, or from social conditioning. And I just wanted to kind of demystify. We use this catch-all term for masking, and you know, it's really about neurodivergent individuals trying to avoid discrimination, stigma, and exclusion by hiding parts of themselves. And what it looks like is things like mimicking behaviors that imitate neurotypical social cues, like gestures or facial expressions, speech patterns to blend in, or compensating, which, you know, in this frame, it refers to like rehearsing scripts or practice conversations to manage social interactions. And that can be, you know, you say hello, I say hello back. How are you? I say I'm fine. Then I'm feeling uncomfortable. I don't know what to do next. So the rehearsed conversation will help me say, oh, I should ask the person how they are. In my mind, I'm thinking, okay, I want to get out of the place. But you know, these sorts of things save you from standing out and looking like rude, or being interpreted or perceived to be an oddity or a difficult person. And then there's camouflaging, and that's a broad term that kind of combines mimicking and compensating, and it's all around the creating an appearance of fitting in. And while these behaviors might help us navigate social expectations or reduce the risk of discrimination, they come at a really significant cost, and the toll of masking is real. You know, it comes at the cost of emotional and physical fatigue, heightened anxiety, you know, diminished sense of self-awareness, that loss of authenticity and self-efficacy. And these are really destructive in the end. These really have a huge impact on mental health. And it can affect everything you do, from interpersonal relationships to overall performance and well-being. When somebody's constantly managing how they present themselves to the world, just to feel safe or accepted, it's exhausting and it's unsustainable. And they're doing that on top of trying to perform, and everything else that goes around, you know, everything else that you have to sort of work on while you're in the workplace. And this is why understanding masking is so important for managers, teams, and organizations. It's not about recognizing, seeing the behavior, being able to point it out, but it's more about creating environments where people don't have to mask, where people don't feel they need to do it in the first place. And I think we're not quite in that perspective yet. And I get a lot of questions on how do I spot somebody who is neurodivergent? How do I tell them that I think that they are neurodivergent because of their behavior? And we really need to be flipping that into, how do I create an environment where it's a norm to behave in a multiple different types of ways, and that we're embracing that difference, and we're creating psychologically safe spaces and building in inclusive practices to normalize difference, and to encourage and to not only normalize it, but to link it to and label that the normalization of this increases mental health literacy, well-being, and it enables an individual to live authentically, maintain their creativity. Ultimately, the goal isn't to fix somebody who is neurodivergent, it's to fix the system and the cultures that make them feel like they have to hide who they are. And I think that's, for me, where mental health and neurodivergence intersects, where it can be extremely harmful if we don't sort of dismantle some of those systemic issues that are creating the need for that in across our workplaces. I'll hand over to the next person who might want to add.
Thank you so much, Zoe, for really breaking down the different scenarios and explaining in depth as to how neurodiversity might present within the workplace. And I was just reflecting that, from a psychological point of view, when you talk about the masking, the camouflaging, the overcompensation, that's quite a huge cognitive burden for an individual to bear, but also emotionally as well. But I really love you're closing the emphasis on that it's not about fixing the person, it's about creating an enabling environment and providing the resources so individuals can really flourish within the workplace. So thank you very much for that. I'll just quickly check whether the other two panelists, Mina and Beatrice, wanted to speak to that. If not, we'll move on to the Q&A. Mina, please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I just want to add a little bit to Zoe's very comprehensive reply and super valuable insights. So just a little bit also on the terminology. I think here we're really talking about sort of mental health and well-being and mental health from the perspective of well-being in the workplace. In addition, and of course our focus is on neurodivergence. In addition, there are sort of diagnoses for mental health conditions, and now we're not talking about neurodivergence, just more generally as well, which similarly to any other kind of impairment, when it is interacting with the barriers in that environment that is preventing full inclusion and participation, it's considered also a disability within the framework of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the UN Disability Inclusion Strategy. And so just to I think it's important to also clarify when we're talking about mental health that like Zoe was saying, neurodivergence is non-visible or invisible impairment or diagnosis. Many mental health conditions are also not visible and can really impact the well-being as well. So mental health has like different sort of understanding, and just wanted to also bring into the discussion that there's the mental health that we would be thinking of in terms of the framework of disability and the understanding of disability. And Zoe was really speaking to also the sort of the well-being mental health aspect, I think. But these can intersect, of course.
Thanks so much, Mina, for adding to Zoe's response. So I'll permit me, Beatrice, if I move on to the Q&A, and I'll hand over to Wilna, who'll be helping with the Q&A. Over to you, Wilna.
Yes, thank you, Nana. Just as a follow-up, actually, to what we were just speaking about, terminology, there's been quite a few questions in the chat related to that. So I'm just going to read. This is a bit double-barreled in some context provided by some colleagues. So one colleague shared, in one of my former contracts, I was delayed medical approval because I listed that I took medication for ADHD. The medical team of the organization got back to me and asked why I hadn't mentioned that I had a disability. This was the first time I ever heard that my neurodivergence was a disability. Do you think that neurodivergent people have to mark that they are disabled? And then as a follow-up, someone said, adding to this, is there a way to disclose neurodivergence without it being automatically labeled as disabled? Does the articulation of this question need to be revisited? And are there ways that staff can be trained to respectfully engage on this topic? Over to you, whoever wants to take. It's a big one. Mina, yes, please come in.
Thanks. I can get us started, and please, colleagues, fill in. I think these questions speak to a really important issue, and it is really sort of that stigma around the word disability as well. So I just want to start off by saying that every person self-identifies in however they want to identify themselves, and there's absolutely not necessarily to use the term disability or label or however we want to call it. So that's very important. So that's the first point I want to make. The second point I want to make is that there's often misconceptions around what disability is. And, I was clarifying that it's not about the impairment, it's about the intersection with the impairment and the barriers in that environment that are preventing the full inclusion of that individual person. And so disability can be kind of a useful concept in that sense. And I think that we really have to do more to in our work in building an inclusive organizational culture and an inclusive workplaces, build this understanding of disability and kind of removing the stigma around that word. But again, I want to emphasize people do not have to use the word disability, but it can be a useful concept in that what we are aiming to do is remove those barriers that are disabling within the workplace. And that includes the biases, the stigma, that is creating fear, like Zoe was talking about disclosing the disability. And then the last point I want to make, I think the point about disclosing the neurodivergence or any impairment that is not visible, that people don't automatically, see. Like I use a wheelchair, people know that I have a disability, but many people have an impairment that would not be visible. So, of course, this has to be done respectfully, respecting the individual person's how they identify themselves, and ensuring the highest level of data protection. On the point, the question about, I want to just kind of frame why the question around disability is asked. Of course, I feel personally that it's not appropriate to question someone, why didn't you disclose your disability? But I want to explain that we currently do not have an adequate way of measuring our progress in terms of having an inclusive organization. So that what I mean is that we don't have a proper way of tracking the number of staff with disabilities. As the number would increase, that would hopefully be an indication that we are successful with the disability inclusion strategy in our recruitment and our attainment of staff with disabilities. So that is why it's asked. But of course, it's up to every individual person how they want to respond, and we cannot require anyone to identify as a person with disability. I feel like that goes without saying, but I want to say it clearly. Back to you, Wilna.
Thank you. Beatrice, I saw your hand up earlier. Did you want to come in as well?
Thank you, Wilna. My point was really similar to the point that Mina made, was that I think a big part of the stigma about this fear comes from this stigma around the word disability. And I guess the most important thing here is to unlearn what we've associated with disability and realize that disability is not a bad word. And we don't need to fear being seen as someone who is disabled or someone who has a disability. And accept yourself like that is a big part of the picture. And of course, you don't need necessarily to identify as disabled but with it comes a very big sense of community, sometimes much more understanding about your own disability, your own impairment, and how it relates to the world around you and to the people that face similar barriers. And it can come as a very important way to also figure out more of your needs and feel more confident also to disclose them and to interact with other people in that context.
Thank you for that, Beatriz. That's really helpful. I'm gonna find, sorry, just lost the other question that I thought would be helpful to ask the panel.
Sorry, Wilna, if I may, I believe Zoe has her hand up.
Oh, sorry.
Whilst looking for the question. Yeah.
Yeah.
Over to you, Zoe. Okay.
Yeah, just a quick reflection, and while you're finding the next question, the person specifically mentioned, medication and the medical kind of clearance process that I think is probably a common thing across all of our agencies. And then that linking to why did you not disclose? And I think I would encourage, I mean, I completely echo everything that both Mina and Beatrice has said, but I would really encourage colleagues to stand your ground in situations where a medical clearance process or a medical assessment for whatever reason that we might be needing when we're entering into employment or we're going to a new duty station, those kinds of situations where that medical clearance is required. When questions are asked about medication, I mean, this applies to not just disability. You know, people take medication for all different reasons. To stand your ground that there is a huge difference between the need to take medication for a diagnosis, an impairment, and then how that relates to you ticking a box that you identify as a person with a disability, or you're collected, your data is collected as you are a proportion of the UN system or the proportion of that UN agency that is an employee with disability. Those two things are completely different things, are two completely different reasons for asking that question. And agreeing with the other colleagues, it's a very personal choice whether to disclose, say, in an application or in an employee survey or something, that you have a disability, as opposed to when you're asked to list the things that you need and the things that you're taking in a medical clearance. We should all be, filling those medical clearances out as honestly and as fully as possible. But if we're asked to then link that to other types of data collection, I would stand your ground to say, why do you need that? What will I gain from linking these two things together? And I'm not opposed to identifying and disclosing a disability, but it's a very personal thing, and it is a very contextual thing. When are you being asked about it? Is it protected? Is it anonymous? And what's the purpose? Why is it needed at that moment in time? And if you see value in it, then disclose. If you feel safe, then disclose. But the connection to being asked about medication and during medical clearances, it's a very weak, tenuous link there. And I would definitely encourage you to stand your ground and ask questions to the person. Why did this need to be asked? Why do you need to? What are you going to do with this? What do I gain from this? And if you get a good answer to that, then perhaps consider it. But I in my own experience, I've not had a great answer. Just like, we should ask because you've disclosed that, or a level of that.
Thank you, Zoe, and especially touching on that sense of having that agency to make decisions, whether your data is used or not, and whether you disclose or not. Mina, did you want to come in with a quick follow-up to that one before we ask our next question?
Well, one point, and then I just want to also say that thanks very much. I have to leave right now. I didn't want to just drop off, but just to build on what Zoe was saying, this is also an area that requires capacity building. Like we really need to have a better understanding within our whole human resource processes, managers, the confidence in, understanding that the medication is not relevant to fulfilling the job and it's a private issue. So we really have a lot more work that we need to do across the entire UN and building our own capacities to better understand. And with that, I thank you very much. I'll leave you to continue. I'm so sorry that I have to drop off.
Thank you so much, Mina. It was a pleasure having you. Thank you. We have lots of questions. Thank you so much to everyone who's been sharing their questions in the Q&A. We're going to try to get through as many as possible. So ask the panelists to keep your responses just a bit shorter to these. But I did want to ask, I found it. Okay. So a colleague shared, neurodivergent staff are also at increased risk of burnout and overstimulation related stress. In Latin America, these topics are still considered taboo and people tend to mask to avoid sticking out. What resources or best practices could you recommend that can later be adapted by organizations to match cultural situations or different duty stations? Zoe, I'll have you go first and then Beatriz.
Yeah, one thing that I'm reading at the moment, I don't know if you see this, the Canary Code. I think I'll drop it in to the question there. It's a book that I think I would recommend whoever asked that question. It's called The Canary Code: A Guide to Neurodiversity, Dignity, and Intersectional Belonging at Work. And it's offers some really useful practical sort of tools and skills. But one thing it does that really, I think, describes beautifully is reshaping masking, reshaping sensitivity, that perception that people who are neurodivergent are extremely sensitive and volatile, from being something as a negative. We're having to mask our sensitivities, mask our traits into something that's positive. So if any of you are familiar with the canary in the coal mine kind of analogy, when there were coal mines, they would take, before they had like monitors of toxic fumes, they would take a canary bird, a little bird in a cage down the coal mine with the coal miners. And when the air became toxic, the canary would pass out. So all the coal miners would know that they needed to move to higher ground and fresher air. And in that respect, I think neurodivergent colleagues' oversensitivity and then their need to mask is an early warning sign. It's a positive thing. It's a positive indicator or a quick negative indicator that there is a general toxicity in the environment that you're working in. So I would encourage colleagues, if you want to read this book, it's a good book. It reframes some of the negative traits that are perception stereotypes of neurodiversity into things that are actually ways of organizations understanding that there is a systemic issue going on or a systemic toxic environment that needs to be addressed. And the first people that feel it are those who are likely to be those that are neurodivergent, and eventually everybody will feel it. So if the neurodivergent staff in your organization are telling you that there is something that there is triggering their masking, it's a really good sign that there are going to be a lot of other colleagues who are not neurodivergent that will be soon following in that step and soon to burn out because of that toxic environment and that disabling environment. I just wanted to add that reflection. Over to you, Beatrice.
Thank you, Zoe. That was a great recommendation. If I just may add, I think I would address the answer to this question to everyone in the room who are a manager or a colleague of someone who is neurodivergent potentially and want to be better allies, because this is all about changing the culture of the organization to make it more safe, more inclusive. So I would say for that change to happen, in the big way, we have to start in individual settings. So I think colleagues, managers should be more proactive and encourage staff to come forward, voice their concerns, and build a true safe space and a trust foundation. And this means listening without judgment, with empathy, and most importantly, believe people when they explain what they need, even if you don't fully understand it just yet. And of course, it's important to foster flexibility as well, especially when you're a manager. Let people structure their work according to their focus cycles when possible. Be mindful of sensory environments within your office, within your team. And last but not least, recognize invisible labor, because sometimes the effort it takes to mask, to fit in, is very real, even though it's not seen. So being an ally really means creating spaces where people can express themselves and bring their full selves to work. And of course, that inclusion can't rely only on this goodwill or good attitudes, because we have to build it into how we operate in order to make it sustainable, of course. So it's also important to make sure this is embedded in the culture of the organization through, for example, integrating inclusion into performance frameworks. So managers should be evaluated on how they foster inclusion within their teams. It's important that feedback loops are well established between leadership and staff with lived experiences, because inclusion must be shaped with persons with disabilities and not for them only. And of course, leaders should also try to discuss neurodiversity and with understanding and respect, open up the conversation, undertake training, open up the dialogue, because inclusion becomes truly lived when leaders show this humility and they admit that they don't have all the answers, but show willingness to learn and to adapt. That makes all the difference.
Thank you so much, Beatrice, and to everyone really who's contributed today. I mean, such an important topic, but we're kind of running out of time, and I'm sure a lot of us could wish that we had much longer. But what we'll do, we'll promise to reach out with extra resources, particularly those that have been requested, and also get back to you in response to those questions that unfortunately we've not had time to address. So let me just thank now our panelists, Mina, who's already left, Zoe and Beatrice, for such an insightful and inspiring discussion, and everyone else who's been part of coordinating this event today. We've had a lot of powerful reminders that neurodivergent staff strengthen our workplaces. They also bring fresh perspectives, creativity, and innovation. At the same time, I believe that today's event has really highlighted how important it is to continue to break down stigma and ensure that our workplaces are truly inclusive and where there's psychological safety. So I really encourage you all to continue to learn from each other. Let's keep advocating for workplaces where everyone is truly supported to thrive. I've really enjoyed being part of this discussion, and I'm sure you have as well. Just a quick reminder before we log out to visit our World Mental Health Day campaign page, which is on the Healthy Workforce webpage. There's also the Trello board there. We have actually two more events this month to mark World Mental Health Month. The next one is Echoes of Silence, Strengthening Family-Centered Mental Health Support in Humanitarian Emergencies, and that's scheduled for Tuesday, 21st. And there'll also be a French version on the 23rd of October, which is Thursday. So once again, thank you very much to everyone. It's been a pleasure to dialogue with you and to learn a lot. One final thing, as you're aware, we have a stigma working group as part of the mental health strategy. So I'm sure the discussions from today will inform the direction in which we go. Thank you so much, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.